This is the news in brief from the United Nations. Rising global inflation is expected to hit emerging and developing economies particularly hard this year, adding to a confluence of crises that threaten us all, the UN's acting human rights chief has warned. Addressing the Human Rights Council on Thursday, Nada al-Nashif said that the world's poorest nations faced average inflation rates of 9.5% this year, well above the 6.6% rate expected in the industrialised world. Ms al-Nashif added that although the world's richest countries had seen employment rates return or exceed pre-pandemic levels by the end of 2021, most middle-income countries hadn't yet managed to recover from the COVID-19 crisis.
The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and exacerbated pre-existing inequalities, setting back development by several years in many parts of the world, weighed down by unsustainable debt burdens and their repercussions for providing social protection. Many countries face unprecedented challenges, including the possibilities of social unrest.
75 to 95 million more people are expected to live in extreme poverty this year, compared with before the pandemic, Ms al-Nashif said. Of these 760 million people already enduring extreme poverty, she explained that there would be 16 million more women and girls than men and boys this year. More than 80% live in only two regions, Sub-Saharan Africa and Central and South Asia, she said. In a related warning, a top independent human rights expert called on Thursday for the creation of a global recovery fund to help states hit hard by extreme weather events caused by climate change. Ian Fry, the UN Special Rapporteur on climate change, issued his appeal at the end of an official visit to Bangladesh. He insisted that the Southeast Asian nation should not have to carry the burden of climate change alone, and he added that for too long, major emitting countries have denied their responsibility for the suffering they're causing. The rights expert, who was appointed by the Human Rights Council in an independent capacity in March this year, said that repeated flash flooding this year in Sylhet, northeast Bangladesh, had exposed women in particular to the most dangerous impacts of climate change. To Sri Lanka, where the country's economic crisis has left women at a higher risk of domestic violence, the UN Sexual and Reproductive Agency, UNFPA, has said. Amid fuel shortages, the UN agency quoted the owner of a women's refuge who said that she didn't have enough funds to fetch a victim who'd called for help. The case is one of many in the country where a lack of work has multiplied problems for families, including more violence for women, the UNFPA said. Official data indicates that 1 in 4 women in Sri Lanka has been a victim of domestic violence. The UNFPA is concerned that the country's once robust healthcare system is close to collapse, and that as government funds run dry, shortages of critical medical supplies have severely obstructed sexual and reproductive services, access to contraception and safe houses for women. To help women's shelters in Sri Lanka, the UNFPA has appealed for $10.7 million to ensure specialised healthcare and gender-based violence protection services for more than 2 million women and girls this year. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. Reports that mass graves have been discovered in the Ukrainian city of Izium are to be investigated by UN rights monitors, it's been announced. The development follows the liberation of eastern areas of Ukraine previously held by Russian or Russian-backed forces. One Ukrainian police officer has been quoted as saying that more than 400 bodies are believed to have been found in one location. In Geneva on Friday, the UN Human Rights Office OHCHR said that UN investigators already in Ukraine would be looking to see if those buried were soldiers or civilians and whether they died in hostilities or from natural causes. Here's spokesperson Liz Throssell.
As you may recall, that was something that came up quite a lot during the fighting, the siege of Mariupol. There were these reports of collective graves, and it was really a case of looking at whether people had been killed, or in some cases people had actually died of natural causes because they weren't able to get medical treatment, and they had indeed been buried in collective graves.
Millions of families hit by emergencies around the world have been left without life-saving support because of the largest funding gap ever, UN humanitarians said on Friday. UN Aid Coordination Office OCHA said that nearly $50 billion is needed to help more than 200 million people, but only around 1/3 of that ask has been provided, and OCHA has taken the decision to release $100 million in emergency funding to help plug critical gaps in 11 operations. Here's OCHA spokesperson Jens Laker.
We know these are difficult times, not least after COVID, where budgets have shrunk and we have seen global recessionary trends and the rest of it. However, the needs are skyrocketing. It's out of control.
The $100 million cash injection will help scale up operations in emergencies that often receive little international media attention in Africa, Asia, the Americas and the Middle East. The 11 countries that will benefit are Yemen, South Sudan, Myanmar, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Uganda, Venezuela, Mali, Cameroon, Mozambique and Algeria. In a related development, OCHA announced that its Central Emergency Relief Fund released $9.5 million on Friday to help struggling farmers in Niger. They've been hit hard by failed rains, which have caused planted crops to fail by as much as 4 times already this season. The aim of the funding is to provide early support to at-risk communities by restoring degraded land, upgrading water supplies, distributing seeds, protecting livestock and supporting health teams. To Myanmar, where a new UN Human Rights Office report published on Friday has urged more countries to stop selling arms to the military junta that seized power 18 months ago. Following widespread international condemnation for the coup and the general's violent repression of opposition voices, the report's authors said that several states continue to supply weapons to those now controlling the country. Some progress had been made to economically isolate the Myanmar military, according to the report, which was commissioned by the UN Human Rights Council, but it noted that much more action was needed, not least targeted measures that should focus on the military's access to foreign currency. The country's de facto authorities had failed to govern in meaningful and sustainable ways and had continued to repress and terrorise the Myanmar people, the report noted. Latest information from Myanmar indicates that poverty has increased at least twofold since the coup. The public health system has effectively broken down, according to the UN Human Rights Office report, which added that more than half of all school-aged children have not been to school in 2 years. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. An outbreak of Ebola virus has been declared in Uganda after a case was confirmed in Mbende district in the centre of the country. The UN World Health Organization, WHO, said on Tuesday that a sample taken from a 24-year-old man was identified as the relatively rare Sudan strain. It is the first time in more than a decade that the Sudan strain has been found in Uganda, which also saw an outbreak of the Zaire strain of Ebola virus in 2019. The latest outbreak follows 6 suspicious deaths in Mbende district so far this month. There are also 8 suspected cases who are receiving care in a health facility. Dr. Matshidiso Moeti, World Health Organization Regional Director for Africa, said that the UN agency was working closely with the Ugandan authorities to investigate the source and support efforts to control it. The acting High Commissioner for Human Rights, Nada al-Nashif, expressed alarm on Tuesday at the death in custody in Iran of a woman after she was detained for wearing an improper hijab. Mahsa Amini was arrested a week ago by Iran's morality police in Tehran. The 22-year-old, whose Kurdish name is Jinnah, fell into a coma shortly after collapsing at a detention centre and died 3 days later, officially of a heart attack. In Geneva, spokesperson for the UN Rights Office, Ravina Shamdasani, said that there was also deep concern at the violent response of Iran's security forces to protests sparked by Ms. Amini's death.
Thousands have taken to the streets in a number of cities across the country, including in Tehran, Isfahan, Karaj, Mashhad, Rasht, Saqiz and Sanandaj, in protest against Ms. Amini's death. Security forces have reportedly responded with live ammunition, pellet guns and tear gas. At least 2 people have reportedly been killed and several injured, and a number have been arrested.
Ms. Shamdasani also noted with concern that legislation had been passed in Iran allowing police to send text messages to women in their cars telling them not to take off their hijabs while driving. Millions of people in Pakistan are still deeply affected by catastrophic flooding, which is not going anywhere, UN relief agencies said on Tuesday. Close to 8 million people have been displaced by the disaster, and the UN, along with authorities and partners, are working together to reach affected populations. Southern Sindh province is still in crisis, with many areas still underwater. To date, more than 1,500 people have been killed in the disaster, including 552 children. Here's Girida Birakila, UN Children's Fund Chief of Field Office in Balochistan, another of the worst-hit provinces.
We don't have enough food, we don't have shelter, and still even the kind of healthcare that is required is not available. Roads and bridges have been washed away. I've just come from the field, and the water is not going anywhere.
As had been feared, life-threatening illnesses and disease have now spread among displaced communities, including cerebral malaria. According to the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, nearly 600,000 now live in temporary relief shelters. The UN agency has coordinated a plan to transport more than 1.2 million relief items to the most flood-affected areas. To date, it has delivered more than 1 million life-saving items to authorities for distribution. Daniel Johnson, UN News.